CEO follows black employee working double shifts who brings food home and is shocked by what he sees. Richard Caldwell was the kind of man people pointed to when they wanted proof that the American dream still worked. 15 years earlier, he had taken over a failing delivery service in Denver and turned it into Sterling Freight Solutions, a logistics giant moving goods across the country. He liked to say his empire was built on discipline, sacrifice, and relentless effort. To him, hard work was the answer to everything, and those who struggled simply weren't trying hard enough. In the boardroom, his words carried the weight of truth. His sharp suits, luxury cars, and towering office symbolized success in its purest form. But outside those walls, far beyond the glass skyline where Richard lived, was another world. One he had never seen up close. A world where workers like Daniel Brooks quietly carried the weight of the company on their shoulders. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share a word of love in the comments. Daniel had been at Sterling Freight for nearly 5 years. In reports, his name appeared again and again, dependable, punctual, never disciplinary issues. He was the kind of employee CEOs claimed to want more of. Steady, hardworking, loyal. Yet unlike Richard, Daniel's story looked nothing like the polished dream of endless possibility. Every morning before dawn, Daniel would lace up his worn boots and step into the cold. His apartment was small, drafty, barely holding together against the rising cost of rent in Denver's changing neighborhoods. From there, he took 2 buses just to reach the warehouse floor. 8 hours often stretched into 12 or even 16, because when the company needed overtime, Daniel rarely said no. He couldn't afford to. To his co-workers, Daniel was quiet but dependable, the man who covered shifts, the one who never complained. They didn't know how thinly stretched his life really was, how every paycheck seemed to dissolve the moment it hit his account. They didn't see the letters slipped under his door, warning of overdue bills. They didn't see the look on his children's faces when groceries ran low before the end of the month. Richard had no idea either. To him, Daniel was just another name in a spreadsheet, another cog keeping his multimillion-dollar machine running. If he thought about him at all, it was only in abstract terms. Efficiency, reliability, output. The human story behind those metrics never entered his mind. On the surface, Sterling Freight was a success story. Revenues climbed, investors smiled, and bonuses ballooned year after year. But for the workers at the bottom, especially those from marginalized communities, life was becoming harder. Housing prices in Denver had skyrocketed. Food costs climbed relentlessly. And while executives celebrated quarterly growth, employees like Daniel found themselves falling further behind. There was another layer too, one Richard had never considered. Workers like Daniel, black men and women who made up much of Sterling's warehouse staff, faced steeper rents, longer commutes, and constant financial strain in ways their white counterparts did not. Landlords demanded higher deposits. Bus routes stretched their days even longer. Doctors' visits were delayed because affordable care was hard to reach. These realities weren't captured in Richard's success metrics, and so to him they didn't exist. At least, not until one autumn night when his routine cracked open. It was late, nearly midnight, when Richard looked out from his office window high above the city. The glass walls gave him a panoramic view of the loading docks below. Usually, the night shift was just a blur of moving trucks and fluorescent lights. But that night, one small moment caught his eye. Daniel Brooks, shoulders heavy with exhaustion, stepping quietly out of the warehouse doors. Richard almost turned back to his work. But then he noticed something odd. Daniel wasn't heading to the parking lot like most employees. Instead, he met a cafeteria cook near the side entrance. A container of food exchanged hands, not with casual ease, but with careful secrecy. Daniel tucked it quickly into his battered backpack, glancing around as if afraid someone might see. It was a simple gesture, but it unsettled Richard. Why would a loyal worker, one of his most consistent employees, act as though he were sneaking contraband? Why hide food like it was stolen treasure? From his office perch, Richard frowned. In his world, workers didn't need handouts. They earned their way just as he had. Yet here was one of his best men, moving like someone trapped between desperation and shame. That image clung to him. Long after Daniel disappeared into the night, Richard couldn't shake the curiosity, or the unease, that something was very wrong beneath the polished image of his thriving company. The next night, he told himself he would ignore it. But when the same pattern repeated, his curiosity became something more. A gnawing suspicion that this hidden act carried a story he didn't understand. And soon, Richard Caldwell, the man who built an empire believing hard work was the great equalizer, would step out of his glass tower and follow Daniel Brooks into a world that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, privilege, and the lives of the very people keeping his empire alive. Richard's decision to follow Daniel that night wasn't planned. It was an impulse, a nagging pull he couldn't explain. When Daniel left the warehouse, Richard grabbed his coat and, for the first time in decades, abandoned the comfort of his luxury car. He followed him on foot, blending into the shadows like a man playing detective in his own city. Daniel didn't head toward the employee lot. Instead, he walked to a bus stop, slumping onto the bench like his body carried more weight than his backpack. Richard hesitated. He hadn't stepped onto public transport in years. Yet curiosity won. He boarded the same bus, sliding into a seat 2 rows back. The ride jolted him. Mile after mile, the polished streets of downtown gave way to cracked sidewalks and boarded-up storefronts. Streetlights flickered, graffiti stretched across abandoned walls, and the roads narrowed into forgotten neighborhoods. Richard sat stiff, out of place, clutching his coat while Daniel stared quietly out the window. After nearly 30 minutes, Daniel stepped off. Richard followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention. Daniel entered a crumbling apartment building. Its metal stairs rusted, its railings loose. The windows were dim, the curtains too thin to block the cold. From the shadows, Richard saw something that lodged deep in his chest. Inside the small apartment, barely furnished, Daniel unpacked the food container. The space was nearly bare. No couch, no table, no comforts of a stable home. Just a thin mattress, a flickering lamp, and a few plastic bins stacked against the wall. And then, 2 children appeared, running to him with joy that looked too bright for such a place. Richard froze. Daniel carefully divided the food into 2 portions and placed it in front of them. He didn't take a bite himself. He only watched as they devoured every crumb, smiling faintly as though their hunger mattered more than his own. For Richard, the moment was like a fracture in glass. The image of his loyal employee was no longer in the report. It was a man working himself to exhaustion, hiding his poverty, and sacrificing his own meals so his children could eat. He turned away, shaken, but the questions wouldn't stop. Why was Daniel, one of the company's hardest workers, living like this? Why couldn't he provide more, even with all the overtime? The following morning, Richard arrived at his office earlier than usual, his thoughts restless. He pulled Daniel's HR file. On paper, it looked flawless. Excellent performance reviews. No complaints, steady overtime. Yet tucked in the margins were small details he had never bothered to notice. Salary advances requested 4 times in a single year, finance notes warning unsustainable pattern. And the pay itself? Labeled competitive for the position. It was far from competitive when measured against Denver's skyrocketing costs. Housing is up 70% in 6 years. Food is nearly 50%. Medical bills are climbing every month. Daniel's paycheck hadn't kept pace with any of it. Richard rubbed his face in disbelief. How many more names in his company were carrying the same silent burden? The truth came faster than he expected. When he summoned HR Director Sophia Reyes, her weary expression said it all. She explained that Daniel's situation wasn't unique. Many employees were falling behind, drowning under expenses their wages couldn't cover. She spoke of eviction notices, overdue bills, and workers skipping meals so their children could eat. And then she went further. The burden wasn't equally shared. Black employees like Daniel faced steeper rents, longer commutes, and fewer healthcare options. They were paying more and getting less, forced into neighborhoods with higher costs but poorer conditions. "The inequalities are structural," she said quietly, "and our policies only make them worse." Richard's chest tightened. He had built Sterling Freight, believing discipline was the key to success. Yet here was proof that discipline wasn't enough, not when the playing field was tilted against his own employees. That afternoon, as he walked through the warehouse, he noticed things he had never really seen before. The tired faces, the rushed lunches, the nervous glances of workers who seemed perpetually behind on something more than just their shifts. It was like stepping into his own company for the first time, stripped of the numbers and charts. Still, doubt gnawed at him. The board would never accept feelings as evidence. He needed something undeniable. That's when he made a decision that would change everything. At the next board meeting, he abandoned the agenda for international expansion. Instead, he projected an image on the wall that silenced the room. Daniel's bare apartment, his children crouched on the floor, sharing a single meal. Gasps echoed around the table. "This," Richard said, his voice steady, "is the home of a man who has given 5 years of loyal service to Sterling Freight, working overtime nearly every week, and he cannot afford a bed for his children." The reaction was swift and divided. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, and others dismissed it as an isolated case. Charles Whitmore, the chairman, scoffed loudly. "One sob story doesn't change financial reality." But Sophia countered with hard numbers: 41% of operational staff below the poverty line. Among Black and Latino employees, that number jumped to 64. Executive bonuses, meanwhile, had risen 25% in the last year alone. The room erupted in tension. On one side, those clinging to profit margins. On the other hand, Richard was now unwilling to ignore what he had seen with his own eyes. And as the voices clashed, one truth became undeniable. This wasn't just Daniel's story. It was the story of an entire workforce, silenced under the weight of inequality. Richard realized that if he chose silence now, he would be complicit in it forever. But could he risk everything, the company he built, his own fortune, even his reputation, to fight for the very people he had once dismissed as replaceable? The answer would come in the heat of conflict, when the board forced him to make a choice that would determine not just Sterling Freight's future, but the lives of thousands of workers who depended on it. And that choice was closer than he imagined. The boardroom of Sterling Freight was built for power. A long glass table stretched across the center, lined with leather chairs where men and women in sharp suits sat waiting for charts, forecasts, and growth strategies. The air usually carried the polished calm of business as usual. But on this day, silence gripped the room as Richard Caldwell broke from tradition. The screen behind him glowed, not with graphs or expansion plans, but with an image that made stomachs knot. Daniel's bare apartment, the mattress on the floor, the flickering lamp. 2 children crouched over a container of food, eating as though it were their only meal of the day. "This," Richard said, his voice firm but heavy, "is what loyalty looks like in Sterling Freight. A man who works double shifts with 5 years of service has never once been late. And he cannot feed his children." Gasps rippled across the table. Some lowered their eyes, others whispered under their breath. But one voice cut through like a blade. Charles Whitmore, the board's chairman, leaned forward, his expression cold. "This is emotional theater," he said flatly. "An isolated case. We are not in the business of fixing personal lives. We are in the business of making profit." Richard's jaw tightened. "This is not isolated. Our own HR reports show nearly half of our operational staff below the poverty line. Among Black and Latino employees, the majority are drowning. These are not numbers on a page, Charles. These are human beings." Sophia Reyes, the HR director, slid a thick file across the table. Inside were pages of data, evictions, unpaid medical bills, wage stagnation, and racial disparities in housing costs. She spoke with quiet force. Our people are not lazy. They are trapped in a system that demands more while giving less. We cannot call ourselves leaders while ignoring their reality. But Charles scoffed. You want to gut executive bonuses? Cut expansion budgets? For what? To feed sob stories? Do that and our investors will walk. You'll bankrupt this company with your bleeding heart. The room stirred with tension. For years, Richard had been the face of sterling success, the man who embodied profit at all costs. But now he stood on the other side, confronting the very machine he had built. He thought of Daniel's children, eating off the floor, and the weight of his own wealth pressed down on him like lead. He took a breath and laid out his proposal. A 30% wage increase for all non-management employees, subsidized childcare, transportation support, and an emergency relief fund. A reallocation of bonuses starting with his own. The eruption was instant. Voices clashed, chairs scraped, and hands slammed against the table. Unrealistic. Financial suicide. This isn't charity, Caldwell. This is a corporation. Through the chaos, Charles's voice thundered above all. You've lost perspective. You've let one man's struggle cloud your judgment. You're risking everything. Our expansion, our investors, our future, for an illusion of fairness. Richard's hands trembled, but his resolve sharpened. For the first time in his career, he wasn't speaking as a CEO protecting numbers. He was speaking as a man who had seen the cost of inequality with his own eyes. If this board rejects these changes, Richard said, voice steady but searing, I resign as CEO, and I will liquidate my 28% stake in Sterling Freight, transferring it to a social impact group already interested in acquiring. I will take every piece of evidence, every file, every image to the press. You think investors care only about growth? Wait until the world sees how you treat the very people who keep this company alive. The room fell into stunned silence. For years, Richard had been untouchable, the man who never bent, never broke. To hear him threaten resignation, and with it a loss of nearly a third of company control, was unthinkable. Some shareholders stared in disbelief, others in barely contained panic. Charles leaned back, his face twisted with fury. You wouldn't dare, he spat. Richard met his gaze. I already have the statement drafted. The air grew heavy, suffocating. In that moment, the board wasn't debating numbers. They were staring into a fracture that could shatter everything. Control, reputation, empire. The stakes had never been higher. The vote began. One by one, hands rose. Some in reluctant agreement, others in bitter defiance. The count was razor thin, every second stretching into eternity. When the final hand lifted, the room erupted in murmurs. By the narrowest margin, Richard's proposal had passed. But the victory was not clean. Charles slammed his folder shut, venom in his voice. You've doomed us, Caldwell. Mark my words. You'll regret this. He stormed out, leaving the board fractured, the company's future uncertain. Richard stood in the wreckage of the moment, his chest pounding. He had forced change. But at what cost? The company he built might never look the same. His power was intact, but barely. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he didn't see profit charts or angry shareholders. He saw Daniel's children, finally eating with dignity. The battle was won, but the war for transformation had only just begun. Because outside that boardroom, thousands of workers were still waiting to see if the promises made in this high tower would ever touch their lives. And Richard knew one thing with haunting clarity. If he failed them now, the damage would not just be financial. It would be moral. The empire he built was no longer measured by trucks, warehouses, or profits. It was about whether he dared to follow through, no matter what it cost. The morning after the vote, Daniel Brooks walked into the warehouse, tired as always, unaware of the storm that had erupted in a glass-walled boardroom. His mind was on the same things it always was, Whether the bus would run on time, whether his kids had enough food for breakfast, whether another day of double shifts would be enough to hold back the rising tide of bills. But tucked into his locker was an envelope. Inside, a letter offered him something he never expected: a promotion to employee welfare coordinator, along with a substantial raise. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight on his chest loosen just slightly. He didn't know that his quiet struggle had lit the fuse of a corporate revolution. In the months that followed, Sterling Freight began to look very different. A community resource center was built beside the headquarters, childcare services, tutoring programs, affordable meals, and even preventive health care for workers and their families. Wage increases rolled out, phased but real, closing the gap that had kept so many stuck in cycles of poverty. Absenteeism dropped, retention soared, and for the first time employees felt seen. Productivity rose too, not because of fear or desperation, but because people finally had the stability to give their best without burning themselves hollow. The company the board once feared would collapse under the weight of charity instead became a case study in resilience. Investors who had doubted the plan praised Sterling as a model of ethical capitalism. Profits didn't vanish, they grew. The numbers proved what Richard had already learned in his heart: when you level the playing field, people rise. For Daniel, the changes were more personal than charts or reports could ever capture. His children had their own beds now. Their school was closer, safer, and with teachers who noticed their potential instead of their hunger. Groceries lasted through the week, and laughter returned to a home that once echoed with worry. He carried the same backpack to work, but its weight felt lighter. Not because the world had grown easy, but because dignity had returned to his life. And for Richard Caldwell, the transformation ran deeper than financials. For years, he believed success was simple math. Discipline plus effort equaled reward. He believed poverty was the result of laziness, that struggle was a symptom of personal failure. But watching Daniel's children eat from a single container shattered that illusion forever. He began to understand that privilege isn't just about what you have, it's about what obstacles you never had to face. He had never worried about whether his children would eat. He had never been told his skin color meant higher rent or longer bus rides. He had never feared eviction after a 12-hour workday. Daniel had done everything right. Yet the system pressed him down at every turn. At the opening of the community center, Richard spoke plainly. For years, I believed hard work was the great equalizer. But what I failed to see was that the field is not level. Success is not simply a matter of effort. It is also a matter of opportunity, and when opportunity is denied, discipline alone cannot bridge the gap. Real leadership isn't measured in profit margins, but in how much we are willing to level the field for others. Applause thundered through the crowd. Employees cried. Families hugged. For the first time, workers didn't just feel like cogs in a machine. They felt like the heart of a company that finally saw them. But this story doesn't end with Sterling Freight. Because the truth is, Daniel's story is not rare. Across industries, across cities, across this country, countless men and women of color are working double shifts, juggling 2 or 3 jobs, doing everything they're told is the path to success. Yet many still cannot afford housing, food, or health care. They are invisible until someone chooses to look closer. The question is, how often do we choose to look? Richard only discovered the truth because he followed one man home. But what if we didn't wait for moments of shock to force our eyes open? What if we chose every day to recognize the systems that keep people struggling? What if we demanded workplaces, communities, and leaders that treated dignity as non-negotiable? Sterling Freight became stronger when it chose equity over excuses. Imagine what could happen if more companies and more people did the same. So now I leave you with this. Daniel's story may have begun with secrecy, with food hidden in a backpack, with children crouched on the floor. But it ended with a change. It ended with proof that when injustice is confronted, lives are transformed. And the question that lingers, the one that should haunt us all, is this: How many more Daniels will we ignore before we finally decide to see them? You've just heard the story of a CEO who followed a hardworking black employee home and uncovered a truth that changed not only one man's life, but an entire company. Stories like Daniel's are happening every day, often unseen, often ignored. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about justice, privilege, and what true leadership looks like, then take a moment to support this channel. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories.